From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Ross Perlin, professor at Columbia in the Linguistics program and co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance. In our conversation, we discuss what an endangered language is and how large cities like New York City are often home to many endangered languages. He talks about some speakers of endangered languages with whom he's worked, including a speaker of Seke, a language of Nepal, as well as a speaker of Lunaape, the indigenous language that was spoken in what is now the New York City area. Here's my conversation with Ross Perlin. Professor Ross Perlin, thank you so much for joining me today. You are a linguist, a translator, and author. You're the co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, author of the book Intern Nation, How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in the Brave New Economy, professor at Columbia in the Linguistics program, and you're currently teaching a class which is called Endangered Languages in the Global City, Language, Culture, and Migration in New York City. And you're writing a book on endangered languages in New York City, and it's going to talk about endangered languages through the eyes of 6 speakers of those languages. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's all right. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Thank you for coming. So today we're going to talk a little bit, not so much about one specific language, which is what we typically do on this podcast, but about a category or a group of languages that's called endangered languages. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that term. How do you define an endangered language, and what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of using that term?
It's one term among many endangered languages, but I think it is, it has proven useful in some settings, certainly for some language activists and linguists, to kind of spotlight the massive loss of linguistic diversity, which is happening across the world, and which linguists, in any case, only began to sort of recognize as a group really in the early 1990s, and sort of understood, and partly in relation to issues of species endangerment as well, of botanical and biological species, even though languages are certainly not species, and there's a lot of differences. Nonetheless, there was some sort of congruence or analogy that was made that was useful for some. What really isn't in dispute is that this loss of linguistic diversity that's happening, however one sort of counts languages or thinks about linguistic practices, it's indisputable that there's massive linguistic homogenization going on. And so I think any way of really highlighting that and bringing resources to speakers of smaller and embattled, endangered, reviving, minority, indigenous, oral languages is a good thing. So there are many ways of trying to sort of define what an endangered language is, and there is the EGIDS scale, for instance, which is a whole kind of graded scale with many points on it, looking at endangerment along various axes, and there are rankings and so on. But that aside, I think the most important thing, almost everybody would agree, is intergenerational transmission, and whether a language is being passed on to the next generation of speakers. And that's what's faltering in so many cases because of the enormous pressures, the sort of language killing pressures coming from governments, coming from businesses, coming from essentially dominant languages, national languages, and their institutions. So, there are certainly other factors involved: language ideologies, people's shame, histories of discrimination, and economic factors and so on. The size of a speaker base obviously is relevant. So there are many factors involved, but I would say intergenerational transmission is the crucial one.
I was wondering, having defined the term, and we'll get into some of these a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about how you personally became interested in this topic. What brought you to, become the co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance? What's your trajectory for coming to this issue?
I've always loved languages, and I was, loving studying many languages, even into kind of college. But it was a specific moment, really, where I was, as an undergraduate, studying abroad in Beijing when I was 21, I think. So this is half a life ago for me. When I heard a Chinese linguist named Sun Hongkai give a talk in Beijing, and he's known as kind of one of the great veterans who has spent his life documenting minority languages in China. And he spoke about that, and this is all in Mandarin, and I was there principally really just to kind of practice my Mandarin and,
Okay.
and learn from him. But I had no real awareness up to that time of the depth of linguistic diversity in China, or indeed around the world, which he put it in context, or the massive loss of that diversity which was happening, or the sort of techniques that linguists were trying to bring to bear to document that diversity. I didn't realize that of the, as sometimes as linguists estimate approximately 7,000 languages in the world, as many as half can be considered endangered by some measures, and that it's precisely that half which is least documented, about which the least is known. And none of these were languages that I had heard of, had any sense of, or that most people, have really. And that was the beginning for me. After that, I kind of found my way to what was the first academic program in this area at the time at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, had the kind of first master's program and the PhD program in language documentation, which is the sort of subfield which tried to respond to this. And then I became involved in some of the same areas actually that Professor Sun worked in Southwest China, where I did my PhD research was a documentation and description project on a cluster of Nungish languages spoken on the China-Burma border, notably one called Trung. So real kind of language documentation work. And then each thing has led to another thing, and came home to New York and became involved in the, at that time, newly founded Endangered Language Alliance, which was an attempt to do this work in urban spaces, recognizing that actually there's a particular opportunity for urban field work of a different kind of nature, because cities actually have been getting more diverse even as the world gets less diverse in many ways.
And some of the works that you've written, and certainly in the class that you're teaching, and I'm assuming also in the book that you're writing, one theme that emerges is, as you mentioned, these cities have a great linguistic diversity, and perhaps a growing or close to peak linguistic diversity. And one that you mentioned in particular is New York City. And I was wondering if you could talk about the linguistic landscape of New York City, how it is diverse, how many languages are spoken here, and perhaps why it's such a linguistically diverse place as well.
So this is very much the topic of the course that I've been teaching now here at Columbia for the last several years, Endangered Languages in the Global City, which focuses on New York, and it's also kind of, I'm expanding on it at length in the book that you mentioned, Chris. So this is something I've really been engaged with now for over a decade, since coming back from China, just recognizing that urbanization is such a powerful factor in what's happening linguistically around the world, such that indeed speakers of very much embattled, endangered, smaller languages are now actually coming to cities, including last speakers even of many languages are coming to a variety of cities, not only New York. But New York is really a real paradigm case, or kind of even a limit case of this. And it has been famously, diverse, really. I mean, going back to its roots as Lenape speaking land, hosting a diversity of Lenape varieties and dialects. And then in the Dutch period, being a sort of commercial entrepot, it was already kind of a unusually diverse place. I've just actually given kind of a talk on this, but there was a sort of early report that there were 18 languages spoken here among 300 to 400 people just within the first years of New Amsterdam. Actually, from what I've looked at for the book, it was probably even more. And these were languages actually from Africa, from Europe, and of course from the Americas. So this is really something that's been with this land now for centuries, but has only kind of continued to accelerate in extraordinary ways. And of course, there have been kind of various ups and downs, but the city's kind of particular position as a gateway to this continent for immigrants, and as a commercial center, and even with the United Nations, a global political center, but a place that attracts people from all places. Of course, certain particular places more, but so the current sort of deep diversity, which is unprecedented in the history of the city and in the history probably of any city, really owes perhaps the most to 1965 immigration reform, which is very much kind of being challenged and discussed now, but really did kind of open the city, and then along with kind of increasing urbanization and global plane travel and other forces around the world, did really open the city to people from all over. And then it's really only in the past few decades that you've had people coming from sort of deep hotspots of linguistic diversity in places like, Central America, West Africa, the Himalaya, Southeast Asia, places which are still, for various reasons, kind of deep redoubts of linguistic diversity. Those people are now coming to places like Queens and Brooklyn, the Bronx.
Can you think of, in your own engagement with New York City, is there like a few hotspots within the city that there tends to be a large linguistically diverse cluster, or is it distributed throughout the city?
To some extent, it's certainly distributed throughout the city, and any given room or building or subway car or even, college campus can be remarkably diverse. But that said, it's not evenly distributed, just as linguistic diversity is not evenly distributed around the world. It's not in the city either. And there are certainly, there are areas that are just remarkable for various reasons. Famously, Queens overall has kind of that reputation. And then within that, Jackson Heights, actually, I just took my class there. We had a field trip, is a place that is instantly remarkable in that regard. Just given, the forces that have brought people from especially South Asia, Latin America, the Himalaya to that area. But indeed, it's also in a lot of neighborhoods that are maybe less familiar to people. And there are certain kind of microcosms where whole regions of the world are kind of fit into a neighborhood, even, if people associate it with one larger language. An area like Brighton Beach is not just Russian speaking, or the greater Brighton Beach area. This is actually a whole microcosm of the former Soviet Union where dozens of different languages are spoken. And, Harlem, right here near Columbia's campus, and parts of the Bronx are home now to, by our count, over 100 languages just of West Africa. And surely that's not everything. We've been working to sort of document and map the city's languages because we saw from our work at the Endangered Language Alliance over the last decade how inadequate the census is when it comes to language. And for various reasons we could spend a whole program talking about, but we've essentially put together a map now which shows over 700 languages. So that would be easily 10% of the world's linguistic diversity. Again, depending on, counting is kind of a fool's errand sometimes with languages, but certainly this is many more languages than have ever been documented for any single urban center. And they're really from all over. You can check that out. There's a free interactive digital version of the map at languagemap.nyc. And it actually grew out of a print map, which is available for a donation to the Endangered Language Alliance, and kind of really just kind of gives a visual impression. You can see where the languages are, and also it's actually over 1,200 sites, and it encompasses the whole metropolitan area. We're not just talking about the 5 boroughs, but there's a great deal of diversity, increasingly in certain parts of Long Island, New Jersey, upstate, elsewhere.
I've looked at that map. I think it's really fascinating. I'll be sure to put a link to it in the description for this episode. So I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned to me as we were getting ready to speak, that your book that you're working on follows 6 speakers of 6 different languages within New York City. And I was wondering if you could maybe pick one of them to talk about that person, talk about the language they speak, and the way that they are speaking it today within New York City, and some of the challenges that they face when they try to continue to speak that language, or speak that language with other people.
Well, one of the 6 that I can highlight that also has a Columbia connection, which is nice, is a language called Seke, spoken in Nepal by people really from 5 villages in an area called Mustang in northern Nepal. It's a language of the Tibeto-Burman family, so it's at least, in some ways related to Tibetan, Burmese, and hundreds of other languages, but it's very much its own language with, at most, really what's been estimated 700 speakers, of whom now a significant portion, in the hundreds, a significant portion are now in New York, and especially in just a small number of buildings, these kind of vertical villages in Brooklyn, a couple of apartment buildings. We've been working with speakers of Seke as part of our larger work on Himalayan languages, and Tibeto-Burman languages have been a focus of mine ever since that time in China. That was the family of languages I was working on. But there had been almost no research or documentation of Seke. It's certainly not generally being passed on to the next generation, but I've had the great fortune to work with one of the youngest speakers, Rasmina Gurung, and we've been working together for several years. She's based here in Brooklyn, but a lot of her family is still in Nepal. The community is very much transnational, translocal, and we had the opportunity with the field methods class, linguistic field methods class here at Columbia, where students get the opportunity to study and work on directly with a speaker, and a teacher, a language that they're not familiar with, and ideally like a less documented, less known language. It's a real opportunity to do original research. And so we had the opportunity to do this with Seke several years ago, where I was teaching and Rasmina was effectively co-teaching as the speaker. And then Columbia students were able to, a number were able to sort of continue with the work afterwards over the summer at the Endangered Language Alliance. Rasmina and I were later able to get a small amount of funding to go to Nepal to do some work before COVID. And we've continued to work since then, are still trying to, find various ways to work on it. And so she's, in many ways, and she's not the only one, but documenting her own language, trying to use it within the context of her vertical village. That it takes various forms, as documentation does, but recording older speakers especially, and stories, and transcribing and translating that, and circulating videos, and working on a dictionary gradually. So there's a whole variety of forms it takes, and yet at the same time, the pressure to switch to Nepali and then to some extent English is pretty intense.
How does she kind of view herself linguistically? What is her linguistic identity from what you've known of her?
Well, one thing I think people, again, probably don't recognize is that speakers of endangered and less commonly used languages are really the most multilingual people, typically speaking, in my experience, 3, 4, 5 languages, and Rasmina does. And it's not something, they haven't generally learned these in classrooms. This is life. This is kind of what they have to do. So, she and other Seke speakers are really very multilingual. And that goes with kind of having multiple identities as well. And Seke was something that she could speak with her grandmother at that, in the past. Now it's something sometimes she can speak with her mother and some elders, but otherwise not much. Even with most other people in the community, it's going to be speaking Nepali. And then there are some situations where she needs to be using Tibetan, or people might be speaking to her in Loke, which is another regionally important language. And then being here and working as a nurse in Brooklyn, and her education, since she came here at the age of 12, everything has been in English too. I mean, there was some English before in Nepal, but so she's really moving among these sort of 4 or 5 languages. And, it's hard to find a place for Seke in there, right? Because it's not something that's paying the bills. And actually, I mean, that's part of what we're trying to do, is make it something that helps pay the bills, and that this should really be a valued activity. It's valuable on so many levels. But to find the funding and support so that at least that there's documentation of this whole linguistic world, which has not been documented.
How did you come into contact with her, and how did she react when somebody showed an interest in a language that perhaps she didn't realize was interesting to other people?
Well, the wider context, as I said, is that we've been working on languages of the Greater Himalaya for some time in New York. So we had a lot of contacts, and it was essentially a mutual friend, or who also from that region, and understanding our needs and interests, and also understanding who she is as well, and that somebody who is a rare kind of younger speaker who also would care about this kind of thing. But at the same time, it's surprising generally for almost any speaker of an endangered language to encounter any outside interest in their language, sadly. It's almost something that people will kind of hide about themselves, or wouldn't think anybody would care about or know about. And indeed, if they've never, you can imagine if you had never seen the name of your language in print, you'd never seen anything on the internet about your language, you had never heard anybody outside your community even refer to the language, you might think that it's just some sort of home speech or some kind of dialect that doesn't really, you don't even know where it fits necessarily. So, an important part of this is really raising the status of a language so that we understand as linguists, certainly kind of will always say that, all languages are equally complex and cognitively sophisticated, and need to be sort of valued and understood regardless of the number of speakers or their political status, or whether they're written or not. Those things are not really relevant. So, but it is kind of a task, always kind of explaining to people on all sides of things that languages are valuable, and that we have to sort of understand what they have to say.
A little earlier in the conversation, you mentioned Lenape, or Lenape languages, which is the language that was spoken here in the New York City area in 1524 when Europeans first came here, and that now has dwindled to just, I think I've read from your syllabus, one native speaker, one speaker of that language. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the indigenous languages of North America, because it seems to me that you have with this category of languages an additional layer of complexity, being that we are in the United States. The languages that are the indigenous languages were sort of there's policies of the United States to eradicate them and wipe them out and geographically remove the speakers. Could you talk a little bit about, have you done any work with indigenous languages of North America, maybe a particular language or generally as a category? How do you kind of conceptualize that, and how do you see some of the challenges that you might encounter with language revitalization, which seems to be happening a little bit more today than perhaps it has been in the past?
When you talk about how languages have been driven out and speakers have literally in some cases had languages kind of beaten out of them, or the speakers have all been killed or expelled in large numbers. And North America is one of the places where you really see that unfolding over centuries. So one estimate from the best information that was available is that north of the Rio Grande, essentially at the time of before European colonization happened, there were some 300 distinct languages, if not many more, not to mention kind of dialects and other forms of diversity. But at this point, a very small number are still being passed on to children and are still have a clear future in front of them because of just the many different kind of policies which have unfolded over centuries. So, so it's just connected to what's happening all over the world, but perhaps even an even more extreme case. And there are many languages in North America that really have just a handful of speakers, like Lenape. That said, language revitalization, as you referred to, Chris, has come a long way. And just in the last few decades, there's been an explosion of new programs and initiatives and efforts, including many here in the Northeast, which are bringing back languages, claiming languages that actually did not have day-to-day speakers even for, over a century or 2 centuries, as in the kind of famous case of Wampanoag in Massachusetts, which has been one celebrated success story. So I should say with Lenape, that it's extraordinary that there still is at least a native speaker in Ontario, and that there are a lot of second language speakers who are trying to revive it as well. One of whom, the late Karen Hunter, who was is really much missed by so many, was coming down to our center at the Endangered Language Alliance on 18th Street and teaching the language for several years, once a month, driving down 10 hours from Ontario, wow, bringing the language back to the city, to some part of its original land, for as far as we know, one of the first time in centuries in class, in the form of a class. And so there are these extraordinary efforts going on, and there needs to be more support. For all of these, there was no funding or support for what Karen was doing. We were kind of, paying out of our little pocket that the Endangered Language Alliance has a little bit to help her kind of come down. But there was little recognition of that, although there's plenty of lip service to some of these things. But the actual support for native languages has been pretty paltry compared to the need. So there are certain measures, there is certain funding mechanisms from the federal government and certain funds that are helping to support some of the language revitalization, but much more is needed. And you're seeing a little bit more in Canada than you are here in the US.
So speaking more generally about what I called language revitalization, is that really the best term to use, or how would you describe maybe what one of the goals of your organization is, which is to have these endangered languages become less endangered or have more speakers? What term would you use to describe that process? And maybe what is a realistic goal for a language that has very few speakers?
Language revitalization is a widely used term, and I think is a useful term. Language reclamation is another that's used. People use different terms in different places, and there are a variety of goals and situations. So, there are some who will look at a language like Cantonese with tens of millions of speakers as now being in some forms endangered and in need of revitalization. And there is a case, of course, you can understand with what's been happening in Hong Kong, and with the fact that the language lacks official support really almost anywhere, and and so on. And as I say, intergenerational transmission and diaspora, these are all kind of factors. So there are people who will undertake and see what they're doing as revitalization, even with very large languages. And then there are situations of, as some people refer to them, sleeping languages that really, as I said, like Wampanoag, haven't had speakers. People are trying to bring them back. And that's very, very different situation and very different needs in those cases. And one new speaker can be a kind of a miraculous event in the one case. And in other cases, you're looking for some very different kinds of change. So yeah, there are a lot of very interesting things going on in that whole area. I should just say that as a linguist, in our organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, we're composed of linguists, activists, speakers, artists, just ordinary New Yorkers, people who love languages. There are a lot of different goals. As a linguist, I think the thing that I can contribute the most is around sort of linguistic knowledge and documentation and the ability to create materials and help with things like, designing a dictionary or consulting in terms of a writing system. Or as a center, we do a variety of things. But of course, the choice to maintain or revitalize a language is always going to be with the speakers, the community itself. But linguists, I do think, need to be engaged with communities, need to be collaborating closely. And there has been a change in the field of linguistics towards more of this. It's just challenging because the incentives of the academic world do not line up with this. And so there are still, for many, the need is to be publishing papers, which are kind of not necessarily related to lived, applied things like language revitalization.
Right. I agree. So I guess in closing, I wanted to ask, we've talked about in different ways the Endangered Language Alliance. Is there anything else that you feel we should mention or cover with respect to this organization?
Just to say that we are one of a number of small organizations in different parts of the world that are trying to work on behalf of linguistic diversity. We're based here in New York, and we have this a focus, which I don't think any other organization has had up to now, on the urban experience and what can happen in cities and what can happen from linguists, including academic linguists or those like myself, with some association with a university, working together with speakers and communities. And but we're very much engaged with the general public too, and we think it's really important for just New Yorkers, anybody in, not just New York, but any city and really any town or any setting, because linguistic diversity is all around us in ways that people, often don't appreciate. So please check us out, Endangered Language Alliance online, and we hope to be having some more public events now again, and those are just places where you can hear languages spoken and used that you won't or otherwise hear. Check out our map and see if you can, donate and get a copy of the print map. People often contact us wanting to learn a certain language or wanting to get more information. We do the best we can with a tiny group, mainly people volunteering. But, we're always looking to talk to speakers of different languages, and we'll do the best we can. So thanks.
Yeah, great. So as I mentioned earlier, I'll be sure to put a link to the map and to the main website of the Endangered Language Alliance. So Professor Ross Perlin, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciated speaking with you about this.
Thanks for having me, Chris.